My Bison is E2 level 50. My general attitude is that if a clear is so tight that the minor difference in stats between an E2 level 50 operator and a fully maxed operator actually makes a difference, I probably don't have the time or patience to create and execute it. But the bear is a bit special. Here, there's essentially only one enemy, and defense is really valuable. And it's the first time where I could really feel the impact of those missing stats. So, I had a choice to make. I could level up my Bison to max level so I can make a better clear, or alternatively, I could use this as a thinly veiled pretext to talk about physical damage, and why even a few points of defense matters so much against the bear. So, let's talk about defense. I'm going to assume that if the YouTube algorithm is sending you to my videos, you're probably really into Arknights. You've probably watched and read a bunch of Arknights related videos and write-ups, and you've probably heard the whole song and dance about physical damage and defense and their shortcomings hundreds of times. However, I find this discussion is usually only talked about in the context of why fighters are bad, or, on some occasions, where Exuziai's damage falls short. The discussion revolves around how their low attack makes it so enemies with even a moderate amount of defense completely nullify their damage, which is all both easy to understand and also completely true, but also buries the lead a little bit. And framing this weakness in this way makes it less obvious where defense is still effective against enemies. So let's talk about how defense interacts with different damage modifiers, how the bear works, and why missing out on those few points of defense means so much in this fight. Let's pretend Hypergriff is making a new boss. They initially decide that this boss should have 1300 attack, and an attack interval of 3.5 seconds. With these numbers, this boss deals roughly 370 damage per second before we take defense into consideration. If we work out what DPS we receive with various amounts of defense, we get this graph. We see that the relationship is for the most part linear, with every additional 100 defense reducing the incoming DPS by just under 30 damage per second. Oh, if you're wondering about that part where it flattens out at the bottom, defense can only reduce an attack by up to 95% of the original attack. So defense above around 12 to 1300 becomes useless here. So we've got this relationship between DPS and defense. Now let's pretend after a bit of playtesting, Hypergriff decides this boss isn't doing enough damage. So what are our options here? Well, the most obvious answer would be to increase the boss's attack, or give it a skill that gives it an attack boost. Here we can see the effect of giving this boss plus 100 attack, or plus 200 attack. Note that we effectively shift the entire graph upwards, but the slope of the line is unchanged. In other words, the effectiveness of defense is unchanged. Each 100 points of defense still reduces our incoming DPS by just under 30 damage per second. But let's say we go with a different approach. Instead of boosting attack, we could boost attack speed. Here's a new graph showing incoming DPS if our new boss had gained plus 100 or plus 200 attack speed. Here, we see that rather than the graph shifting up, our line just becomes steeper. Units with low defense take significantly more damage like before, but defense gets you down the curve towards 0 faster. In this case, at plus 100 attack speed, 100 defense reduces our incoming DPS by just under 60 damage per second. And at plus 200 attack speed, our incoming DPS is reduced by just under 90 damage per second for every 100 points of defense. Multi-hit attacks work similarly. Here we see the effect if the boss gains a 2 times or a 3 times multi-hit. And likewise, here's a graph showing the relationship if we give the boss some final damage amplification. In this case, I'm showing what 50% and 100% final damage amplification would look like. And of course, we can stack multiples of these effects. If Hypergriff, hypothetically, gave this new boss 200 attack speed, 2 hits per attack, and 100% final damage amplification, the new defense to DPS graph would look like this. Note that I've had to change the scale of the y-axis here to fit the new line. On our hypothetical boss, we see that 100 points of defense now reduces our incoming DPS by just under 350 damage per second. In other words, each point of defense is now worth about 12 times as much as it would against a more traditional enemy that just has plain old normal attack buffs. For reference, the 3 5-star male medics have off-skill heals per second of around 160 to 225. So in this hypothetical scenario, just 100 points of defense is enough to reduce our need for just under 2 medics. At this point, it should be becoming clear why defenders, and more precisely protector defenders, are nearly mandatory if you want to tank the bear, and why crushers like Ulpianus just get instantly melted. So let's start talking about the bear's mechanics. But aha! I've tricked you! Because we've actually been talking about the bear the whole time. This graph actually shows the bear's damage profile during its first phase. Always title your graphs, folks. So we can start looking at why an E2 level 50 Bison falls incredibly short of a max level Bison. The difference between the two is 75 points of defense. Bison's module gives him plus 20% defense when blocking an enemy, which makes the difference between the two 90 defense. But if we zoom in, we can see that because of this massive defense amplification, the difference in incoming DPS is about 310 damage per second. That's roughly 1.5 Noel's worth of healing off skill. And it's impossible for me to get that much healing out before Bison dies. In this clear, I actually end up deploying Bison early in phase 1. This means I also don't get to make use of his module, putting us around here on this graph. However, this early deployment allows me to use Bison's skill before the bear arrives, and that gives me enough time to get Tin Man's attack debuff up and running. Okay, I've yapped long enough. The main takeaway I wanted from this was to show that, for physical damage, things like attack speed and multi-hit attacks increase damage dealt, but also increase the efficacy of defense. One of the side effects of this is that it is easier to more or less nullify someone's damage if you have enough defense, i.e. the fighter problem. But even with enemies, which typically have much higher attack stats, the effectiveness of a defense is still equally as good, even if you're nowhere near that 95% mark. This bear is a bit of an extreme case, where all but the highest of defense values can survive. But for more normal physical damage enemies, if you see that they have attack speed buffs or multi-hit attacks, and you're struggling to survive against them, you might find your plain old regular protector defenders provide more value than you would normally expect. Okay, I'm done talking for real this time. Thanks for watching.